Welcome to Road to Recovery.
Welcome to Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents with Sagi Shaked. Sagi is the founder of Shaked Law Personal Injury Lawyers and is ranked as one of the top 100 trial lawyers in the United States by the American Trial Lawyers Association. With a wealth of experience in personal injury, wrongful death, and complex litigation cases, he passionately advocates for victims and has recovered multi-million-dollar settlements and damages for his clients. I'm your host, Abigail Vaca, and today's episode is Life After a TBI, the long-term consequences of a trucking accident brain injury. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me, how can a TBI affect a person's ability to work and earn a living?
Yeah, so when we talk about traumatic brain injuries and all the sequela of things that can happen to someone who's been in a traumatic brain injury, first thing that comes to mind for me, or one of the things that comes to mind for me is, how does this impact someone's finances and how does it impact their work life, right? We talked about in the past someone having memory problems. And if you're having memory problems, imagine being at the job site or on the job, whether it's the office or on a construction site or wherever it is that you're at, and you forget conversations. What if it's a conversation about safety and other people's lives are in your hands? Or what if it's a conversation, let's say you're in a law office like we have here, and we talk about deadlines and you forget to calendar a deadline and a case gets dropped or dismissed. So those things are critical when we talk about how it impacts your specific life. So when we talk about, think about the job, you can't concentrate anymore because you have a brain injury. So a person needs to stay focused. And if they can't focus, they're easily distracted. That could have a hindrance on their employment. What if you have a processing speed, right, issue where again, the person looks normal. They look like you and I, Abigail, and basically the brain just doesn't work as fast as it used to. So if I'm talking at the speed I'm talking now, and you're only hearing 3 of the 5 words, you may not understand what I'm saying because your brain is not able to process the materials as fast as it used to or at the rate someone's speaking. So if someone's speaking too fast, that's a problem for someone who's been or has a traumatic brain injury. Also, one of the sequelae you can get from a traumatic brain injury is fatigue. So in your brain, you have the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland controls your growth hormone. When your growth hormone gets impacted, that can cause fatigue. So you have people who are normally, we had a case, I'll give you an example. It was a case where a client got hit by another car. And prior to getting hit, our client was able to work 15 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week for years and had no problem. And suddenly, a couple of weeks afterwards, you see the client. He was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury, but he's having a hard time staying awake at work. Not because he, suddenly was tired. This is, we have history of 20 years of history. Suddenly he's falling asleep at work. And then you see people in his office. They had a group chat on texting and they're taking pictures of him sleeping and commenting that look how tired he gets. Look how he falls asleep. So that's fatigue. So fatigue is real and that's a real sign and symptom of a traumatic brain injury. And then when you have all that, imagine you're fatigued or you can't concentrate. There comes the frustration and the stress of dealing with it. Why is it that I can't do what I normally did before? Why am I having a trouble remembering? What do they think of me? Do they think I'm a klutz now? Do they think I can't do my job now? Will I lose my job? So those are some of the things that people encounter, at least that I've seen, that could affect their wages. It could affect how much they get per hour or their salary, or they may even lose their job because they're having issues with, again, we'll just speak in the law office. If you can't remember to calendar stuff or you can't remember when you're giving an argument and suddenly you forget what you're supposed to say, that's a problem in front of a judge or in front of a jury. So those are things that can impact someone's life dramatically, especially financially as well. So financial and career-wise, a person can have a tremendous impact when someone has a traumatic brain injury.
So it sounds like there can be all sorts of emotional and psychological changes after a TBI. In what other ways does a TBI impact a victim's daily life and independence?
The emotional and psychological portion of it is huge, because a lot of times you'll have insurance companies say, "Oh, the person's cognitively normal, right? They're doing well in school, they're doing great at work." But sometimes people put on their game face, right? They'll show up to work or they'll show up to school and they're not the same person when they get home because at work or at school, they're doing what they need to do. So, psychologically or emotionally, when someone injures what they call the front part of their brain, that's the frontal lobe, you can have emotional issues, mood swings, depression, anxiety, mania, anger. You see this a lot, or people are just quick to get angry. They just, they're not as patient as they used to be. So, what does that lead to? It leads to relationship struggles. We've had clients who, after having their TBI, broke up their relationships, not because they wanted to, it's just because the individual became, you can't manage them. They were just completely out of control. Sometimes people have depression and anxiety, and that can really take over someone's life when you have anxiety about every little item. PTSD, where someone has flashbacks, those are really bad. To reliving the event or any one thing can do it. So sometimes, let's say you were in a car crash, and you don't necessarily have to have a car crash to give you a flashback or a PTSD. It could be driving on the road, and in your peripheral vision, you may have seen a green car and you were involved in a crash with a green car and just seen it in your peripheral vision. It doesn't have to be in a crash, and person can come home and just have tremendous PTSD. And there, the depression will come, the frustration will come. The personality changes also impact the person's friendship and also with their coworkers. So a lot of ramifications when you have, a frontal lobe injury can really, really change for people. So obviously they need to take care of that and deal with it. So that's dealing with the emotional aspect of it. I think you had another question regarding the impact on daily life and independence. I think that's what you asked, right? And so again, and some of this is tied in. So we talk about the daily struggles that everybody goes through. So sometimes it's a little easier to think about when someone, for example, has a hand injury, right? And it's easy to see the person can't do stuff with their hand. They can't brush their teeth like they used to, can't tie their shoes. If it's a female, they can't put on their bra or put on their dress, or anything, or even shower. But with the brain, your brain is like your CPU, right? For a computer, it runs your entire body. So simple tasks can become very difficult, like remembering when you go grocery or how to pay the bills for some people if their brain's been impacted. Again, depending on what part of the brain. So if you have these cases or if you're suffering through one of this, you need to communicate this to your lawyer. You need to really dig down and ask your client questions on what's going on their daily with the client. How are they handling basic things, again, from grocery shopping to time management to dealing with chronic fatigue or with headaches. What do they do when they get a headache? Some of our clients, when they get headaches, they run into a room and they close and make it all dark because they can't deal with the light. The light sensitivity gets to them. Or what about someone who has lower processing speed? Imagine what that does to everyone else on the roadway, right? We're on the roadway, we're driving, but their processing speed is not as fast as the average person who doesn't have a brain injury. So now they're putting everybody else at risk when they're driving. So driving becomes difficult because you can't make those last second decisions that you need to make, or the decisions that have to be made at a moment's notice are not going into your brain as fast as possible. So if you're representing someone who's been injured and has a traumatic brain injury, that needs to be communicated not only to the insurance adjusters and defense lawyers, but also, if you're going to trial, to the jury. So, these things are super important. And then one more thing, when you're having, think about sensory overload, there's too much noise, you're sensitive to too much noise, or you have the bright lights, or people, for example, who are sensitive to noise and go to crowded places, they're going to be completely, we'll use the word freaked out, but they're going to be people who are sensitive to noise are going to be in a crowded place and they're not going to be able to function like a person who doesn't have a traumatic brain injury. So think about those types of things when you're representing people who have these types of injuries. Remember, the frustration kicks in. It's over and over and over, continuing to kick in. And that leads to depression for people. In fact, there's a study that says people who suffered a traumatic brain injury will have a 2 to 3 times more likelihood of committed suicide than someone who hasn't suffered a traumatic brain injury. So those are things when you're representing someone who has a traumatic brain injury, or if you have a traumatic brain injury, make sure you're communicating that to your lawyer. Hopefully your lawyer knows that information.
Wow, so it sounds like the symptoms run the gamut. What kind of long-term medical care and rehab might someone need?
The long-term medical care and rehab will depend, I guess, on the type of traumatic brain injury the person has. So if you've got a severe traumatic brain injury, those are so obvious. We have a couple of those clients where they're bedridden, they cannot move, they're going to need constant round-the-clock care. That's obvious. I mean, everyone's going to know that. It's the ones that are mild and moderate where the person looks normal, right? Because the person could be brain injured. Their brain, they just look normal on an outward appearance. It's not like a hand where you would see that their hand is deformed or they've had metal in their hand where we can see it. But if a person, a brain injured person, since you're not able to tell, they need some treatment. And again, it's different than the severe ones. So what kind of treatment are we talking about? Therapy. There's cognitive therapy. There's therapy that can help them with their processing speed. Some people have word salad. They get words confused or they stutter when they never stuttered before. There's psychiatric care. Remember, we talked about the emotional part, the anxiety, the depression. So there's counseling. There's, medication as well, depending on what the person's going through. Sometimes they need physical therapy for their balance, their coordination, to get their fine motor skills back because, again, the brain got damaged. Speech therapy for those people who are struggling with communication like they used to. Again, because a nerve in the brain or a cranial nerve got impacted, if, for example, it's the sixth cranial nerve, that'll impact vision. So depending on what part of the brain got impacted, depend on the type of therapy they need. But you can talk about occupational therapy. Again, something with the hands. That'll deal with stuff like dressing, cooking, using technology. Sometimes they just don't know how to do it like they used to because, again, the processing speed, which is huge. So when you have your TBI client, or if you're a TBI victim, there's lifelong therapy or again, psychiatric therapy or therapy that the person would need. So these are the things you really need to look for when you're representing someone, or if you have a TBI. Make sure that you're adequately relaying the information to the lawyer. And if you are the lawyer, make sure you're relaying the information to the insurance adjuster. And if you go to trial, the jury.
I was going to say, all of the costs associated with that will add up quickly. What financial burdens do TBI victims face, and how can that be addressed in a legal claim?
Yeah, those are great questions. That's a great question. So we'll address it in two parts. One, what's the financial burden? So imagine a person goes to the hospital, they're going to doctor, so there's medical bills. Some people have health insurance, some people don't have health insurance. Even if you do have health insurance, you have deductibles. So you've got medical bills. We talked about how traumatic brain injury, between all the signs and symptoms, can really hurt your job and hurt your career. So there could be a financial component that way, where if you lose your job, how are you going to pay your bills? How are you going to pay your mortgage? How are you going to pay your car? How are you going to pay for your kids? How are you going to pay for your spouse? How are you going to pay for food? So these things are real when it comes to it. If you need long-term care, where are you going to get that from? That's a cost. So you have medical bills, you have lost wages, long-term care. And what about mental health costs? If you're seeking, mental help as a result of that, that's another cost. Now, these are all play in. If you do have a traumatic brain injury and you have a case, this is where your lawyer, or if you're the lawyer, you need to put it all together. And some of them are called economic damages and some are called non-economic damages. So economic damages are something that you can put your hands on. The medical bills, we know that's a certain amount of medical bills. The future medical bills, we know what that number could be. Lost wages, we know what that number can be. So those are economic. But then there's the non-economic component, the pain and suffering damages. Every state is different, but that's why you need a lawyer. You need a lawyer to address your non-economics and your economics. But again, not just any lawyer, because there are differences in lawyers.
And when I think about the non-economical part, I think about family members and caregivers. What should they know about supporting a loved one with TBI?
So when a loved one suffers a TBI, I think the number one thing, one is get help, but the number one thing I think is that's super important is be patient, because sometimes or a lot of times those mood swings, those emotional issues, that frontal lobe injury that person has, the memory can be very frustrating for the family members, because they're used to seeing one person and now they're seeing someone else. And one of our cases, our client said, that's her daughter. It looks like her. It sounds like her, but that's not the daughter that she had before the crash occurred. It's a completely different human being. They may look alike, but that's not the person I know. That's not the person I raised. So think about that when you have, if you're a caregiver or if you're clients, you speak to the caregivers. It's so important. Be a good listener, help them with their organization because they have the memory issues, and then encourage them to go to the doctor, go to the rehab so they can get better. But again, going back, my takeaway is be patient. And then if you're a lawyer, your TBI clients, you have to be patient with them, because sometimes they'll forget. Sometimes they won't show up to meetings. Sometimes they need multiple reminders, even the day of the meeting, to show up because they just don't remember. And so those are some of the things that I would focus on, or key takeaways from that question.
Great advice. Thank you so much for joining me again today. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents with Sagi Shaked. For more information or to connect with Sagi, visit shakedlaw.com. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite platform.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.